With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Tactics on News Radio 1440. I am your host, Caleb Colquitt. Thank you for joining us, whether you're on YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, Periscope, however you're listening to us. We certainly appreciate you making us a part of your day. This is Tactics, of course, where tolerance isn't love, speech isn't violence, and disagreement isn't hate. So, you're probably sitting there wondering, why is Caleb on after midnight? His normal show time is 6 p.m. He's about, 6 hours late for his own show. And I know that you're sitting there thinking, well, Caleb's finally lost his mind. And, well, the thing is, you're actually correct about that, but not for the reasons that you're thinking right now. So here's what happened. As those of you, I've talked about it on the air. I'm sure a lot of you that watch my show regularly understand this. I've taken a job with Faulkner University, and sort of juggling this two jobs thing has been quite an adventure, and it's been quite an adjustment, but it also means that sometimes I don't have quite as much time for the show as I normally did. And if you're paying attention to the past couple of shows, I told you that it's move-in week and my schedule is going to be interrupted. It's actually a miracle that I'm even up and still have the energy to do this show, but I didn't want to go too long without being with you, the audience. It's how much I love this job. It's how much I love communicating with you and having this forum to share political ideas, get your feedback, that kind of thing. And I also know that because I am so incredibly wildly popular, that typically what happens in the city of Montgomery is there are riots in the streets if I go too long without a show. And since I probably won't be able to do another one this week, I knew that I needed to do one this week. So that's why I'm on way after hours, after dark, as it were. That's the reason that I'm coming on so late, and I'm kind of hoping that I know that there's probably not going to be a lot of people watching right now unless you're, just ridiculously insomniatic and you have nothing better to do at 12 o'clock in the morning. But we do actually have some really good local news, and I think that that's really important for this super late show, where you may be needing a little bit of good news. It's not going to be all doom and gloom like it usually is on Tactics. I mean, that's kind of what we do, because we do political commentary. Political commentary. Wow, it really is late. Political commentary, and that means that most of it's bad. Most of it, isn't necessarily what you would want to hear. But I really do enjoy it when I get to bring people some good news. And that is that Andy Burcham has been selected to replace the late and very great Rod Bramlett. Now, for those of you that saw my tribute to Rod Bramlett, you know that I worked in Auburn University right out of college. And because of that, I did get to know a lot of the figures there at the company. I got to work with Auburn Network, and Andy Burcham was one of the people that I got to work with. Granted, I didn't work with him directly all that often, but I have met him a few times. I've heard him. I've heard his work. I've heard him on the broadcasts, as I'm sure most of you have. And I've actually been his board op a few times. And I got to say, there are a couple of people that I think could have done a good job. And I think I actually talked about that on the show. I thought that Barry McKnight would have been a fantastic choice. There were a couple other people that I talked about, but I mean, Andy's the guy. Andy is phenomenal, very talented, and he can't replace Rod Bramlett, but nobody can replace Rod Bramlett. And Andy, just like any other broadcaster that gets put into a situation like this, he'll rise to the occasion and he'll make it his own. I have no doubt about that. Andy is a great guy. And especially with a tragedy like this, somebody like Andy coming in to really stable the ship, he's not going to be exactly like Rod. Nobody expects him to be. And so, there are very few people that I would consider worthy of taking that position, being an Auburn man myself and also being a broadcaster who's even more critical of broadcasters than the average person. But I think Andy's going to step into those big shoes. I really do. Andy is a phenomenal broadcaster. And when it comes to Auburn sports, the guy's an encyclopedia of Auburn sports. He follows it very closely. And with that new shakeup in the Auburn network, it seems as though Brad Law is going to be co-hosting Tiger Talk. Now, Brad Law, I did not meet. I've had several correspondence with him because, of course, News Radio 1440 and Sports Radio 740 are both Auburn affiliates. We kind of catch the spillover whenever 740 has a conflict and they have to put an Auburn baseball game or something like that on 1440. So I've worked with Brad a little bit. And I have heard a lot of his stuff. If you've ever heard the not Tiger Clips, I'm sorry, that was like 3 years ago, Auburn Sports Today, which replaced Tiger Clips. If you've listened to Auburn Sports Today, Brad Law is the guy who does it. Got a great voice. I would argue probably better than mine, honestly. And I don't say that about a whole lot of people, but Brad Law, I think that he will do great in that. We're kind of moving it up. If you imagine it like a Pez dispenser, Andy's moving there, and then Brad's kind of taking over Andy's position. And some really talented broadcasters, people that I consider myself very fortunate to be able to work with. Good things are on the horizon for Auburn University. I'm glad that they went ahead and before football season and even the preseason stuff really got kicked off, that they made this decision. And I think that they made a good one. So really looking forward to football season. I know that that's a holiday here in the South. It is coming up. War Eagle, y'all. I am very much excited about this. Now, we do have something that is local news of a little bit more serious note. And it does have to do with Judge Roy Moore. So you know it's going to get controversial when we're talking about Judge Moore. So Judge Moore did a visit to DeKalb County for a breakfast event. So he's going and talking to a Republican club down there. And as you know, Roy Moore is running for Senate again. Yeah, he is. But Judge Moore has been very well known for his hardline stance on homosexuality. I mean, for Pete's sake, it's the reason that he got kicked out as the Chief Justice, is that I won't go into all the details, but the long and short of it was he gave essentially an executive suggestion. I don't say necessarily an executive order because it wasn't something that had to be followed as a function of law. So it was more like an executive suggestion that the clerks and the local judicial system should not be issuing marriage licenses to homosexuals. That controversy wound up getting him a sentence that they didn't actually suspend him, but they effectively did. They suspended him until the end of his term, which was effectively like removing him from office without technically doing it. Because frankly, I thought they were cowards and didn't want to go all the way to say, okay, we're kicking him out, so we're going to effectively kick him out without actually doing it. And so that, of course, led to Judge Moore resigning. And here we are after that failed attempt at the Senate. So this is no surprise to anybody in Alabama. They know Roy Moore's very clear-cut history with the issue of homosexuality. And I'm going to go ahead and read what he said at this breakfast that's causing this stir. Civil unions, I would have been against civil unions. I think people want to live together, fine, if two people want to live together and do what they want in private. I don't think we should recognize it if it deals with sodomy. Sodomy used to be against our laws. I can't support sodomy. I can't support it. If a Christian supports sodomy, I wonder what the reason would be. All right, so there's a couple things that I do want to wade through here, and I will say that on this issue, even though he's phrasing it in a way I probably wouldn't, I think it's important for me to remember that, hey, Judge Moore and I are on the same side of this, so if I am being critical, keep in mind that I'm being critical of approach. I'm not being critical necessarily of the content itself, because I don't think that Christians should support sodomy. And he's, of course, using sodomy in the old-timey sense, meaning specifically homosexual activity. That's where the phrase actually comes from. We kind of think of it as being something else now, but originally that was the meaning. And why the word sodomy, why is it used that way? Because of Sodom and Gomorrah. What was Sodom and Gomorrah's great sin? Well, a lot of things, but the thing that they were probably most famous for in the book of Genesis is that they were pretty engaged very publicly in homosexuality. And so that's where the phrase comes from. So the way that Judge Moore appears to be using it in this sense is specifically in the homosexual sense. So that's, I think, the where he's coming from. But here's the issue that I do take with this statement. You can be morally opposed to something and not think that it should be outlawed. And this is something that I think Judge Moore, even if he doesn't actually believe it, he certainly comes off this way, and his spokesmen have certainly presented it that way. That if Judge Moore thinks that it's a sin, it ought to be outlawed. And that is a problem, because you guys know I wear the Christian banner pretty openly. I dedicate a section of my show every single time to doing a Bible lesson. But saying, well, if it's against the Bible, then we shouldn't do it. Well, are we going to make lying illegal? Because that opens up a whole other can of worms. Are we going to make gossip illegal? Like, there's all kinds of things that I am opposed to morally that I'm not opposed to legally. In other words, even though I may not like the action, I don't think that it should be prosecuted as a function of our legal system. And so those are two entirely different things, but Judge Moore has this weird thing where he tends to marry the two. And I understand where he's coming from, but at the same time, I think that his approach is completely wrong, and I could not get behind that. And so he's saying support sodomy. Now, if he's talking about, I don't think a single Christian can say that sodomy, and again, we're talking about it in the homosexual sense specifically, that homosexual actions are a good thing and still be a Christian. Okay, I agree with that. But by support, are we talking about support it in the sense that you're saying that it's all right morally? Because someone that's saying, yeah, homosexuality is fine, yes, that person is clearly not following in the teachings of Jesus Christ. But if we're talking about a person that is just saying, okay, I don't think that it should be illegal, and I don't want stormtroopers busting into somebody's bedroom and telling them that they can't do that, well, that's not supporting it. That's just not wanting it to be illegal. Those are two completely different things. For example, I might think that it's a very bad thing for somebody to eat an entire cake every day. I mean, from a health perspective, that's a really bad thing. Not a moral thing, but I think that that's a really bad idea. It doesn't mean I want the government enforcing it. And so these are completely different standards that we're dealing with here. And so I do wish that Judge Moore could clarify a little bit there, because he has this, like I said, odd tendency to sort of mix what he thinks is personally morally right and what he thinks ought to be legal and illegal, which are two, I wouldn't say entirely separate things, but not the same thing for sure. So here's the other thing that's odd about this. If he does mean it the other way, you can't say that you think people ought to be allowed to do what they want in private, which is part of this quote, and then also be for anti-sodomy laws, which he seems to kind of advocate for, because he seems to sort of harken back to a time where sodomy was illegal. And by the way, it was. But here's the issue. You can't simultaneously say, oh, it was better in the olden days, back when we had sodomy, and then also say, but I think people ought to be allowed to do what they want in the privacy of their own homes. Those two things don't coincide. Now, perhaps what we could do here, and again, this would kind of break with what we kind of know about Roy Moore and the kind of the way that he operates, but you could, if you were looking at this in a vacuum and taking away some of that context, you could be reading into that and say, well, he doesn't want it illegal, he's just saying it's morally reprehensible, which it is. And so what he's actually saying here is people ought to be allowed to do whatever they want, but then he harkens back to the anti-sodomy age. One of two things is having to happen here. Either Roy Moore is calling back to the sodomy law either for no reason whatsoever, or harkening back to the days of the sodomy law, anti-sodomy laws, and saying that they were a bad thing because he believes, as he just said, that people ought to be able to do what they want in private. Or he doesn't really believe that people ought to be able to do whatever they want in private. And so it seems contradictory just based on what I know from Roy Moore. Maybe he'll clarify that, I don't know, but every time he seems to try to clarify it, or one of his spokesmen do, it seems to be a massive blunder. And another thing that I found odd is he's also opposed to civil unions. But the problem is civil unions are effectively a contract. You don't have to be married to be in a civil union. In fact, a lot of people do that instead of marriage. And you could be, have a contract with anybody that's over the age of 18 at least, that has the legal authority to sign a contract. So I don't understand what he's talking about with not being for civil unions. And that's really where this whole thing gets sticky. There's so much ambiguity in this statement, which is actually kind of weirdly uncharacteristic about Roy Moore. I mean, the thing that people like about Roy Moore or hate about him, regardless of which side of the fence you fall on, is that he tells you exactly what he's thinking. Some people really don't like what he's thinking. Some people really do. But the point is, he's usually very straightforward, but he's not very clear in this one. But civil unions are effectively a contract. And so what are you going to do? Carve out specifically a section that says, if you're gay, you can't if you're gay, you can't engage yourself in a civil contract with another person? Because what if I, just to make things legally easier, engage in a civil contract, a civil union with a roommate? Nothing sexual going on there. We may even be dating women while that's going on. But for legal purposes, for whatever reasons, I may want to form a civil union with him, or form a civil union, even though I wouldn't do this. I don't really believe in premarital habitation, unless it's with a relative or something. If I were rooming with a girl, that I could engage myself in a civil union with her, even though we're not interested in one another that way. And so if you're going to create a specific carve out and specifically say, well, if you're gay, you can't do this, then that, by definition, is discrimination. Because when it came to the marriage license thing, and granted, I think that we should be getting the government out of marriage entirely, but when it came to the marriage license thing, that technically was not discrimination. Because if you're a gay man and have feelings for other men, the law applied to you exactly the same as it applied to anybody else. A straight man could only marry a woman, and a gay man could only marry a woman. Technically, that's not discrimination. But this would be if you're saying anybody can get a civil union, except specifically gay people, they can't. Well, that creates a whole other can of worms. And you actually are discriminating if that's the case. So there's a whole slew of reasons why that's fraught with legal landmines, as it were. So here's another quote from the judge. The LGBTQ VRSTUV, that is pretty funny, actually. I don't know what it is. LGBTQ, when they first came out, said transgender? Never. That's dumb. We'd never have that. Do you know what transgender is? That's not biblical. If that's biblical, God created man and woman. And when men want to be women, I was watching MASH the other day, talking about Korea, Vietnam. I was watching MASH, talking about, what's his name, Klinger. He wanted to get out of the army because they didn't accept him as transgender. Now, I guess he would get a promotion. Okay, now, Judge, I hate to do this to you, but you're completely wrong about Klinger. Klinger didn't want to get out of the army because they wouldn't accept him as being transgendered. He wasn't transgendered, and he wanted the army to think that he was crazy and get him out that way. I guess Judge Moore is not much of a MASH fan, or maybe he just hasn't seen that many episodes, but that's a pretty big mistake from somebody watching MASH. I would figure that Judge Moore was a big MASH fan, but I guess not, or maybe he just misspoke. I don't know, because it seems like he was struggling to remember Klinger's name too, but his underlying point, though, is good, which is we're living in a time that is so ridiculously asinine, and they constantly move the goalpost. Because you remember that back before Obergefell came out a few years ago, that gay people would actually get offended at you for equating them to transgender. If you talked about that, they'd say, oh, how dare you? We're not the same as transgender. We're just men that love men, or women that love women. They actually got upset with you for lumping them in with transgender. And now what did it take? 6 months after Obergefell came that they were already on the transgender bathroom thing? You see, that's the reason that we know that the left is just spewing a bunch of crap when they tell us, oh, we just want this. We just want gay marriage. Well, they got gay marriage. You know what happened? Immediately they moved the goalposts and started saying, we need rights for transgenders. And the newest thing that's going to come out is pedophilia. We've already had movements towards bestiality, trying to normalize that. I mean, they're constantly moving to a new victim class to try to uphold as the flavor of the week, as it were. And it's predictable because if you've spent any amount of time reflecting on the past and looking at what happened, you know what's coming down the pipe. But anyway, Judge Moore's overall point is good, and I actually made it a while back because I remember we were talking about this. This is the kind of crap we used to make fun of. The whole joke in MASH is that Klinger's not really transgender, but he's dressing like one so people will think he's a freak. There's no way you could do that today because the transgender community would freak out. The whole point was he was trying to get the army to go, that dude's nuts. He wants to wear ladies' clothing. He thinks he's a woman. We're getting him out of here. And by the way, you'll remember in a few episodes, they reveal that Klinger is not the only one that does that. There's actually other guys in the army wearing dresses trying to get out on a Section 8. And this was kind of common because it was so bizarre and so odd, and people rightfully so regarded it as strange, that was the reaction that you got. We used to make fun of this junk all the time. Ever watch any old Looney Tunes? Which are by far the best ones, by the way. The new ones where they tried to make the Looney Tunes into a sitcom, that was awful. You ever watch the old Looney Tunes? Bugs cross-dresses practically everything he's in. Like, he'll be being chased by Elmer Fudd or Yosemite Sam, and then all of a sudden they come in the running sequence, and then there's Bugs dressed in drag, and I don't know why a rabbit dressed in drag is attractive, but apparently they all find it that way. They do that joke in Foghorn Leghorn. They do it in Wile E. Coyote. I mean, there's a slew of Looney Tunes that does this, and it's because it is funny. It's so weird and bizarre that people find it amusing. And along those same lines, look at Monty Python. Monty Python, the old British comedy show. They did the I'm a Lumberjack song, which is hysterical, where it's this big manly lumberjack, and he's talking about putting on dresses and a bra and, and high heels. But this isn't even that long ago. I used a bunch of old examples just now. But there's actually even recent ones. How I Met Your Mother, that was a 2000 sitcom. And there's a joke in there where Ted asked Barney, hey, you want to go play Spot the Trainee? One of the new interns is a trainee. And he says, you want to play Who's Hot and Who's Scott? I mean, and then Barney goes, Ted, it's the one in the turtleneck. It's always the one in the turtleneck. I mean, Judge Moore's point is well-founded that this is junk that we used to make fun of because it's so bizarre. Everybody knows instinctively that it's way outside the norm. It's not even close. And yet we're all sitting here acting, I mean, at least the left is, pretending as though this is a completely natural, normal thing that we all should accept. No, it's way outside what is viewed as normal. And still to this day, gender dysphoria is considered a mental illness and should be. And then this was the last quote that he said, and we'll move away from this. LGBT have an agenda. Okay, that's obvious. They won't even put my name on a billboard on a church because they would get attacked. Who speaks against the LGBT? Tell me that last politician you heard talk about transgender rights. Even the Supreme Court hasn't recognized transgender rights. That one's a little odd because I'm not sure where he's coming from. If you're talking about politicians talking about transgender rights, that's actually a pretty popular topic. So his point that no one's talking about it is a little weird. I'm not sure where he was coming from or if he misspoke there, but that's odd. But his underlying point about the social justice warrior mob, the SJWs, is well-founded because they will go after and trying to ruin the life, straight up ruin the life of anybody that opposes them on this issue. But on that, the thing that really left a bad taste in my mouth and really bothers me more than anything else is the idea that churches wouldn't put his name on a billboard. I guess there's some kind of personal story behind that, and maybe there were some extenuating circumstances, but why would a church ever put a person's name on a billboard? For any reason. I'm confused by that, whether it's Judge Moore or anybody else, and he's saying that churches aren't going to put his name on billboard because they're afraid of the fallout of the SJW mob, which, I mean, the SJW mob is real, and they actually would do that. But I'm just very confused about what church is putting people's names on billboards. The only person that ought to be on the billboard for a church should be Jesus Christ. I mean, that's our mission, isn't it? I don't know why we would be putting any politician or any other person, for that matter, their name on a billboard, so that's just really bizarre. But regardless of all the points that I've just made, I think one of the big takeaways from this is it does showcase how politically poisonous Judge Moore is to anybody under the age of about 50. And I know that people over 50 tend to vote at a higher rate than people under 50. But if you're anywhere under 50, probably more like 60, you sound like a dinosaur. And I'm not saying that because I have a problem with him sharing his faith. I don't have a problem with that at all. I'm saying his approach and the way he's presenting it sounds archaic. Now, if you sound archaic because you're speaking the truth, I don't have a problem with that. I've been accused of sounding archaic because I'm just quoting what the Bible says, no telling how many times. So I get that that's not a good reason to back off of something. I'm just saying to Judge Moore, you are specifically presenting the message in such a way that is not taking into consideration how it's going to be perceived. Now, I am not suggesting, and I think that anyone that's watched me for long enough knows this, I'm not suggesting that you sacrifice truth to make it sound unoffensive. I'm saying if you want to change hearts and minds, if you want to actually be an effective warrior in this fight, you do have to adjust your approach. And just spouting off, well, this thing isn't biblical, or I think this is wrong, it's not a policy and it's not a good reason to outlaw something. I mean, Lord knows if we all lived by the laws and the rules that are presented in God's word, the world would be an amazing place. But that can't be the government's role. The church is in charge of making sure people are following the Bible. And so far, we're not doing a great job of it, quite frankly. But that's not the government's role. And the thing that does scare me about Judge Moore, and I think scares a lot of voters, specifically anybody under the age of 50, is that the guy sounds like he wants to create a theocracy, which would actually be against the New Testament, which would actually be against what Christ envisioned. He doesn't want a kingdom of this world. He was very clear about that in the Gospels. And that scares the mess out of anybody from, I would say, about my dad's generation and down. And it's one of the reasons that I think it would be so difficult for him to get elected. I still think he's the only candidate in the Republicans that are running right now that would not be Doug Jones, or at least has a chance of losing to Doug Jones. I think pretty much everybody else, it's a sure thing. If it's Roy Moore, it's kind of a toss-up. Not saying he'll absolutely lose to Doug Jones, just saying it'll be close. And I don't think it'll be close with anybody else. So speaking of that race, one of his political opponents was in the news yesterday, John Merrill, our own Secretary of State. Now, John Merrill did an interview where he was discussing, surprise, surprise, the gun issue, which it's in the news. It's what's on everybody's mind. I think he was on Jeff Poor up at our WVNN, which is the Huntsville version of our station. So they're the Cumulus station for Huntsville. And he said, we don't have a gun problem. We have a spiritual deficit problem. And what I mean by that is people have turned away from those basic moral principles and foundational values on which our republic was established. They put us in a position to where we have too many things that are tearing us apart in regard and leading us to these individuals taking those kinds of actions that are destroying our society. Bingo. John Merrill absolutely hits the nail squarely on the head. I don't know that I could have phrased it any better. Not that I'm the end-all be-all on that, but you understand what I'm saying. Even somebody that specializes in communication, that does this daily, I don't think that if you sat me down and had me workshop that for a couple of hours, that I could have done that any better. And since we were just talking about what was going on with Roy Moore, this is a very clear contrast to it. Now, is John Merrill making a moral argument? Yes, he absolutely is. The difference is he is very clear in his language and what he believes both policy-wise and morally. Because if you look back at it, he's saying, first of all, guns aren't the problem. So that's the policy, thing that's attached to it. He's saying, I don't want to restrict guns. Guns aren't going to solve the problem. But then he goes into what the real problem is, that it's a spiritual deficit problem. And he talks about the underlying core issue being that we have turned away from those core values that we used to hold as a country. And he's exactly right. Is he saying the government ought to fix it? No. Is he saying that things he doesn't like or does like should be at center stage and that should be something that's actually enacted into law? Not saying that at all. He's saying, here's the problem. Here's what we have to do. And for somebody like John Merrill, that is known as such a policy wonk, that even has I wouldn't say a reputation of being stiff, but, he's a very buttoned up individual. The guy knows what he knows. He knows his stats. He knows his figures. Very smart. But this shows he can also talk about social issues and still be pretty darn good at it. So props to John Merrill. I mean, this one's definitely a W in his column. And if he continues giving statements like this throughout the campaign, I think that John Merrill has a very good shot at being our next senator. He'll have to win the primary first, and whoever wins the primary, I think, becomes senator. But if he can pull this off, if he can continue to give statements like that, where he does come at it from a place of morality, he does come at it from a place of shared values, uses language that brings people together, and does so in such a way that he doesn't back off on his principles, man, I mean, that's the whole package right there. You couldn't ask for a whole lot better than that. But I want to speak to this just for a second, because even though this is not something that John Merrill said, and I'm in no way attributing it to this, there are people, actually he's kind of saying the opposite. He's getting to what the core of the issue is. There are a lot of people that are trying to blame things like violent video games. Now, you guys know that I'm a gamer. I really like talking about video games. But I don't typically play the more violent ones. Your Grand Theft Autos, your Call of Duties, not, casting judgment on anybody that does per se. Although Grand Theft Auto maybe a little bit. That one's pretty rough. But a lot of these violent video games, they just don't appeal to me. Frankly, I know it's because I'm a big goofy kid, but I tend to like the games that are really more geared towards kids. I like Mario, I like Zelda, I like your Final Fantasies, that kind of thing. I don't really get into the whole Vice City, all the other Red Dead Redemption. It's just not my thing. And maybe it's because I don't like shooters, but it doesn't really appeal to me. But where John Merrill's getting at the real core of the problem, a lot of these people are trying to scapegoat it onto video games. But here's the issue with that, and John Merrill actually sort of indirectly points this out. There was a new study that looked at video games and looked at it over the course of a decade. So a very intense, very well done study out of the UK that looked at different kids, different teenagers that were playing violent video games. And you know what they found? Absolutely no correlation in an increase in aggression versus kids that were not playing violent video games. And this just confirms data that we've had for years. This is not the first study along these lines. There have been study after study after study on this. Now, does it affect you? Yeah. But what they have found is that it does not increase your aggression and certainly doesn't lead to acts of violence. And to anybody that was willing to really think this through, this should have been something that was obvious. Because here's the thing. You're coming dangerously close to committing a cause and effect fallacy. Is it more probable that a normal person, just your everyday kid, goes to the store, picks up one of these violent video games, pops it in, and all of a sudden becomes psychotic? That doesn't really sound like it makes a lot of sense. Now, alternatively, is it more plausible for a person that is already kind of psychotic and already violent and already prone to hurting other people, or at least contemplating it or fantasizing about it, that when he goes to the video game store, the first thing he wants to do is pick up a game that is as violent as possible? We have seen a correlation in mass shooters and people that are going out and doing these things and them playing violent video games. That's a fact. But the video game is not what's causing it. A lot of these guys are playing these games. Some of them aren't. You've got people like the Vegas shooter that, for all we know, never played any of these games. We've had shooter after shooter, with whether it's Islamic terrorists, that aren't playing any of these games at all. A lot of them do, but some of them don't. And so it clearly can't be the cause. And these studies, these statistics back that up. John Merrill is hitting at what the actual problem is. It's not that a normal kid is playing these violent video games and becoming a psychotic killer. What is going on is they are both effects of a similar cause. And this is also true for our opioid crisis. This is also true for our suicide epidemic, which unfortunately is getting worse. And it's true for the reason that our society continues to accept abortion. These are all side effects of the same malady. We no longer respect life. We have thrown out the core values that used to unite us as a country because we believed all kinds of different things. Our politics have never meshed. They've never really meshed up, even since the beginning with the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. But one thing for the vast majority of American history that we have all come together on is that we value human life. It is sacred and it is worth protecting. We don't do that anymore. We don't teach it to our kids. There are so many people out there in my generation and younger that have grown up in a society that largely disregards the sanctity of life. And things like our suicide epidemic, things like our abortion still being legal, those are all side effects of that same thing. We no longer cling to God. We no longer cling to the Bible. We no longer hold those values that we once had, that everybody's life matters. And because of that, because nothing is sacred anymore, then of course we no longer operate in the way that we used to. See, I don't think that these violent video games are causing mass killings. I don't know that they're necessarily moral, and I don't understand how some people can play them. But they're not turning people into psychopaths that are willing to murder people. We are having mass shootings for the same reason that we have an abundance and a market for violent video games. We no longer hold that core value, that truth that is found in the book of Genesis and in the Declaration of Independence, that all humans are made in God's image. And if you no longer hold that at the core of your being, then all of a sudden life just isn't sacred anymore. All of a sudden life isn't necessarily worth protecting. We've been floating around in this sea of moral ambiguity where everything is subjective and morals change with the wind and the situation determines what is right and what's wrong. That's why we're here. That's why we're at this place where people no longer look at another human being and see them as a brother, as a fellow creation made in God's image. You want to know why we're having mass shootings? That's why. And John Merrill gets that. I mean, that's essentially just a longer form way of saying exactly what John Merrill just summed up so succinctly. And he also says, now I'm not for increasing restrictions on firearms, but I do think the laws we have on the books currently need to be enforced. Amen. They were placed there to protect us, and we need to make sure that they're being adhered to at all levels. Now, I think that what John Merrill is saying is absolutely correct. Spot on. Now, what he's suggesting there, enforcing current gun laws, is that going to solve every gun tragedy? No. Because like he said, the core problem is not that. The core problem is our moral decay. But enforcing the gun laws would have prevented several of the mass shootings that became big news stories. Parkland is a great example where several different law enforcement agencies ignored laws on multiple occasions and allowed that guy to not only roam free, but then also get a gun. And so there was incompetency on multiple levels in that one. And it's not the only one. There's several other mass shootings where government incompetence led to somebody doing it. But here's the thing. Sometimes there are no signs. In the case of one of the shooters at the mass shooting that we had this last week, the guy had no record. There was no reason to believe that that guy would have committed a mass shooting. None. And so no amount of gun laws, no matter how stringent, would have prevented that guy from having a gun, unless you just ban all the guns. And even then it probably wouldn't have, but that's a whole other discussion. But this is the issue that we're running into. That if we just enforce the gun laws that we have on the books right now, there are at least some of these tragedies that would have been prevented. And that will go a long way to actually helping us figure out how to deal with these things. And I have to say this. You contrast that with what was just said. Secretary Merrill is now talking on some social issues, and he's doing it very well. I have to applaud him for that. So, bravo, Secretary Merrill. If he keeps going on this route, I think that he's going to be a phenomenal candidate. Now, it is time for me to go to a commercial break. But when we come back, I am going to be reviewing, I know that this isn't technically news, but I'm going to be reviewing the new Reese's Lover Krispy Kreme donuts. So be sure to stick around for that. That's coming after this break.
Hey everybody, heading south on I-65 between Huntsville and Birmingham, and a thought struck me. I was reading the other night from the Gospel of Matthew, the story where Jesus walks on the water and then Peter requests that Christ let him come out on the water too, and to come towards him. And it's a story that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. The Apostle Peter steps out onto the water, a very bold thing to do. And then all of a sudden, he starts getting distracted by the storm that is going on. There's wind, there's waves, there's rain, and he starts looking to the right and the left and seeing how turbulent the sea is. And he takes his eyes off of Christ, and immediately he starts sinking into the water. And I think that says a lot about the way that we're supposed to look at Christ in our life. Everybody has storms. I don't care who you are. I don't care what kind of life that you live, whether you're rich or you're poor, you live in the country, live in the city, whether you've got a lot of family, whether you have virtually no family. Everybody's got storms. Everybody has things in their life that just don't go their way. Things that they have to deal with, whether it's money, whether it's sickness. Something happens to everybody on a pretty regular basis. And I think that where we start going wrong, where we start sinking, is when we start focusing on the waves, we start focusing on the rain, we start focusing on the storms in our life, rather than looking forward at Christ. Now, Peter already knew that the sea was stormy. He was in a boat. He was very aware of the fact that the storm was raging pretty heavy at that point. So, what happened? He started out right, and then when he stopped focusing on Christ and started focusing on the terrible things going on around him, when he started focusing on them and that became the focus, he became afraid and he started sinking. And that's kind of like driving in a lot of ways. If you focus too much on the storm, If you focus on what's going on around you, if you focus too much on the other cars or start looking behind you and worrying about that, then you're going to lose focus on your goal, and you're either going to go in the wrong direction or, unfortunately, much worse, you wind up wrecking. That's obviously not good. And so, just like Peter, I think that the point of that story is that we have to keep our eyes constantly focused on Christ. Are we aware of the storm? Sure. Do we do the best that we can to deal with the circumstances of our life? Absolutely. That's something that the Bible really helps us with. But there's a difference in being aware of the storm and doing something to deal with the storm and focusing on the storm. We focus on Christ. And if we focus on Christ, we have faith in Him that, yes, the storm is there. Yes, we know it's there. But that whatever the storm happens to throw at us, it'll be okay because our focus is on Christ. It's a question of our priorities, and it's also a question of, do you trust God enough to bring you through the storm? And if the answer is yes, then all we have to do is look at Christ, keep ourselves focused on Him, and walk straight ahead. And that is going to be a much better way to live than constantly worrying about whatever new wave or whatever new rain or whatever new wind shows up in our life. Keep our eyes focused on Christ and walking forward so that one day we reach Him. That is the way to live that the Bible prescribes. That is the way to live the path that the Christian is asked to walk.
Well, that's really strange. I had the raw video in there, and then I just basically put my palm right up against the camera. I'm sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, so I am going to go ahead and review the new Reese's Donuts at Krispy Kreme. So check this out. I was super stoked about this. I'm sure that a lot of people were, because if you've known me for any amount of time, you know that I love Krispy Kreme and I love Reese's. So this is combining the two. And this is the package. I really like it because it's got the two different kinds of Reese's in it. So if you can't see, there are two different kinds of Reese's donuts. There's the chocolate lovers and the peanut butter lovers. And it's my job to settle controversies and to try to help you make tough decisions. That's part of what we do here at Tactics. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm going to try to solve this controversy of which donut is better, the chocolate lover Reese's or the peanut butter Reese's. So it is somewhat counterintuitive, though, because I'm going to go ahead and try the peanut butter first, because I think that's going to be the one that I probably like better. Okay, first thing I notice, this is a really heavy donut. I mean, it's not like, 10 pounds or anything, but that is a much heavier donut than I'm used to. I'm used to a Krispy Kreme being just, you can barely even feel that it's in your hand because it's so light and fluffy. Not so with this one. This one's actually got some girth to it. So we'll go ahead and see how it is. Oh man. Oh, that is beautiful. Okay, so the icing is peanut butter, but the filling is chocolate. Really, really good. And I will say, even though the chocolate, the filling is chocolate, which I wasn't expecting. I was expecting it to be all peanut butter. The filling is actually chocolate. And the icing is more peanut butter flavored, but I do taste the peanut butter more prominently. So I think that that's what they were going for. Oh man, excellent. I would say scale of 1 to 10. 1 being Bernie Sanders, 10 being Ted Cruz. I don't know, about I'd say a 9. Yeah, solid 9. All right, so this is the chocolate lovers. We'll see if this one's actually better. They're actually really similar. There's very, very little difference in the two of them. I do taste the chocolate a little more prominently because that's the icing, but there's actually barely any difference at all. I mean, they're both really good. Um, if you blindfolded me, I think I could still tell the difference, but I'm honestly not 100% sure that I could because I mean, obviously I can see it and that affects my taste. Okay, on that one, there was a little bit more peanut butter filling, and I think that I appreciate that more. And like I said, I tend to like the peanut butter even more than the chocolate, which is saying quite a lot for me. Hmm. I'm gonna have to go with the peanut butter lovers. I think that that one's actually better. So the peanut butter lovers is a 9. Chocolate lovers maybe like an 8.5 and 8.75. Honestly, they're almost the same donut. Like I said, that first bite blindfolded, I'm not sure that I could have told the difference. The second bite I would have. I just got a little bit more peanut butter filling. And so, oddly enough, the peanut butter filling, having more of it in the second bite, allowed me to differentiate even better between the two, which was weird. But yeah, so this is a pretty good experiment. I got to do more of these because it gives me an excuse to eat donuts at like 1 a.m. So it's like being back in college. Yeah, so that's my review. The Krispy Kreme Reese's donuts. If you have to get, you're not going to go wrong with either one of these. And frankly, I think that they probably came out with the two different flavors that are practically exactly the same, just to sucker people like me in to buying two, because now I have the excuse, oh, well, I have to get both of them to try both. I think that's probably what's going on here. But no, both very, very good donuts. I give a slight edge to the peanut butter lovers, but frankly, you're not going to go wrong with either one of these. Wow, I've got donut stuff all over me. But that's another thing too. If you have a beard, you understand my pain because guys with beards realize what a pain it is to have to constantly fiddle with your beard because you're constantly getting food in it. But you know, that's the price of manliness. All right, so great experiment. Try it out. Go down to Krispy Kreme. Get both of them if you want to do like me and just have an excuse to get both. But if you get either one, you're not going to go wrong. If you like peanut butter a little bit more and you're like me, slight edge to the peanut butter lovers. That's the better one in my opinion. So let's go on to the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And today's daily dose of stupid. Boy, we've got a good one for you today because there are several people involved in the daily dose of stupid because the daily dose of stupid is not one person, it is a conference. So here's what happened. The Gun Sense Forum happened over this weekend. And at this Gun Sense Forum, which was hosted by Everytown for Gun Safety, you had virtually every Democrat that is running for president, which at this point I think is 170. You had every Democrat that's running for the president right now showing up at this thing, giving their 2 cents, talking about specifically gun control. And they can call it gun safety if they want, but it's gun control. If you're taking people's guns, it's gun control. Now, I consider gun control using both hands when I shoot my pistol, but you know what they're talking about. So we'll just go ahead and dive right into some of the clips. I tell you, and before we do, I will just say a quick disclaimer. Remember that Everytown for Gun Safety is a lobbying group that is funded by Michael Bloomberg. So, I mean, they're very much in the tank for the anti-gun lobby. So just keep that in mind when you're watching the tips. They know who the audience is. They're catering to that audience. So this first one is Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden both talking about the NRA. So that one will be fun. Let's take a look. any second.
The gun industry controls Washington, and we have to fight back against that corruption.
The reason why they don't want what they know is rational gun policy is they'll sell fewer guns. They'll sell less ammunition. Who in God's name needs a weapon that can handle 100 rounds? For God's sake.
Okay, well, a couple things there, Sleepy Joe. First of all, which actually didn't appear very sleepy in that clip. So, props for Joe Biden for actually showing that he is still alive. Well done, Joe. So creepy Uncle Joe up there talking about this. Yeah, first of all, almost all guns can handle 100 rounds. Just about everyone, including handguns. You put a magazine that's big enough on a handgun, it will handle 100 rounds. And so this thing that he's saying, well, who needs a gun that can handle 100 rounds? It's not the gun, you idiot. It's the magazine. And just about any kind of gun that has a magazine, you could modify to have 100 rounds. If you could make it big enough, you could make one that holds 10,000 rounds for a handgun. That is a possibility. It would be dumb, but the point is, you could make it. So, Joe, even in a very short clip, Joe Biden continuing to show his absolute ignorance on this subject for which he is talking about. Now, to the main point that they were talking about here, the NRA. This is an oft-repeated lie by the left that the NRA is controlling everything, or as Elizabeth Warren is saying, that the NRA is controlling Washington. They have a stranglehold. They're the puppet masters sitting behind and pulling the strings of various politicians. They're just buying off politicians like they're going to Walmart and it's a rollback sale. They're just shoveling politicians into their cart and buying them up with all their evil lobbying money. We are the NRA. That's the kind of thing that they're trying to put inside people's minds. But is it accurate? Is it true? Well, let's actually look at some numbers. First of all, the NRA their contributions for the 2018 election cycle, so the previous election cycle, was 873,000. That's it. Didn't even crack $1 million this time. They're nowhere near the top donors. In fact, they're in the high hundreds. I think that the last time I checked, they were like 300 or 400. Pretty close to 400, if not. They're like 370, 380 something. So they're nowhere near the top donors. And they give nowhere near the amount of money to lobbying or contributions as Planned Parenthood or teachers' unions. But here's the real irony in all that. Keep in mind, this is at the Gun Sense Forum, which is hosted by Everytown for Gun Safety, which is not the only, but certainly the largest anti-gun lobbying group. And if you're looking at Everytown's contributions to campaigns for the 2018 election cycle, 4.16 million. So well over 4 times, almost 5 times what the NRA spends. And they are there at the conference that is being hosted by Everytown for Gun Safety, talking about how evil the NRA is, how they're just pulling the strings of these politicians. But actually, if anybody's buying politicians, it would have to be Everytown for Gun Safety. Now, do I believe that they are? No, I don't. Because their contributions aren't anywhere near the top one either. But the point is, you can't say, well, the NRA is just sitting behind these closed doors in these dark, smoke-filled rooms, and they're just buying off politicians who they can control with money. When you're literally standing there on a stage provided by an organization which lobbies for the same thing that the NRA does, on the opposite side of it, obviously, but the same issue, and is spending almost 5 times what the NRA is. Now, granted, because I do believe in showing both sides of this, the NRA does spend a lot more in lobbying. But lobbying isn't campaign contributions. If you're talking about buying politicians, lobbying is just the NRA going out there with their spokespeople and saying, hey, this is what the NRA believes. That's very different than actually giving money directly to politicians and saying that, well, they're using that to buy their votes. They didn't even spend $1 million in the last election cycle. Not the last election year, the last election cycle. And Everytown for Gun Safety is spending almost 5 times that. The hypocrisy is absolutely absurd. They don't even realize the irony of what they're saying while they're standing on the stage at Everytown's event. And here's the thing that you also have to remember about that. The NRA has members. Everytown for Gun Safety doesn't. It's strictly a lobbying group. The NRA is an organization. They do lobbying, but they also have a magazine. They also do gun education, gun safety. There are a slew of other things that the NRA does that Everytown USA doesn't do. They are strictly a politically only. That's the only thing they do. The NRA has a wing of that. They have a branch of that. But for Everytown for Gun Safety, that's everything. And they have various affiliates that also that's the only thing that they're concerned about. Moms Demand Action, for example. They're strictly a political group. The NRA is not. Politics is a big part of what they do. A lot of people would even argue the biggest part of what they do. But they're also doing things like hunter ed and gun safety courses and teaching people marksmanship. And they also have a catalog and a magazine and merchandise. And so there's a lot of other things that the NRA does that Everytown for Gun Safety doesn't do at all. And they're actually funded by members. Now, the NRA does have money that comes in from gun manufacturers and other sponsors. But with Everytown for Gun Safety, that's all they get. They don't have membership dues. They don't have people buying their merchandise. All their money is donations. And so there's a world of difference there. So let's actually look at some of the breakdown of where the NRA's money is coming from, because that was the allegation too. If you'll look at what Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden were saying, Joe was saying, well, they're doing this because they want to sell more guns. And that's really everything that's driving them. It's just profit. And the gun manufacturers are using the NRA sort of as a shell group to justify buying off politicians. Well, let's look at how much of their money is actually coming from the gun manufacturers. Roughly half of it is all members and private donors. Half of the NRA's money comes from just membership dues and private donations from those members. So you can't say that for Everytown. All their money comes from donors. They might be private donors, they might be corporate donors. But either way, they're specifically donating to lobby. So there is a difference there. And then about 10% of the money that comes into the NRA is from advertising. And that can be from gun manufacturers and very often is. But that also means that's another chunk where they're not just straight giving money like they would if they were advocating for Everytown. They're specifically buying ad space. In other words, they're getting something in return. Is it supporting them? Sure, in a roundabout way. In the same way that News Radio 1440 sponsors are helping us out, but they're also getting something in return. It's not like they're not donating to News Radio 1440. It'd be great if they did, but they're not going to do that. So 10% of that revenue isn't even just a straight donation. So there's a world of difference in comparing the two. And another thing that really should be considered here, you may remember this meme from the Tactics Radio page from a while back, and it was true then and it's true now. So I'll go ahead and get it to pull up. You'll see, there we go. So you'll see there's a graphic, and it shows the entirety of gun sales and ammunition. And you'll notice that there is a massive spike in gun sales during the Obama administration where people were afraid that they were going to take away their guns. And so I had in this meme, Barack Obama, the world's greatest gun salesman. But there's a lot of truth to that. And so here's the question. If gun manufacturers were really just concerned about moving product and making sure they sell more guns and more ammo, as Joe Biden alleges, wouldn't they be hoping that you get elected? Or somebody like you? Somebody that has that sort of Damocles hanging over their head of, well, they're going to take away your guns? Because if that's what the gun manufacturers are about, if that was the only reason they were in it, they need to be giving donations to you guys. You're the ones that are scaring people into buying more guns. Gun sales have actually dropped off considerably since Trump took office. You can look at the numbers. And so this whole narrative of, well, they're giving money to them because they're scared that they're not going to make more profit. I'm sorry, the numbers just aren't there for that. If they wanted to sell more guns, they'd want a Democrat in office. It's about more than that. Do the gun manufacturers want to make a profit? Sure, every business does. There's nothing wrong with that. And I'm sure that part of their concern of guns being banned is that eventually they wouldn't be able to turn a profit. But that's not the only thing they're worried about. If they were worried about that, then they would want a Democrat to be in office, because Obama didn't have any meaningful gun restrictions. And yet gun sales skyrocketed. And so if you were some kind of evil, shady businessman that didn't care about the people, didn't care about gun rights, they were just in it to sell more guns, they would be doing the opposite of what the gun manufacturers are doing. And next is a clip from Andrew Yang, showing some of his ignorance on guns as well. And to sort of set the stage here, he was just asked a question by a lady about having a gun in the house, and one of the children in this story actually dies from that. So it is a very tragic premise, and his response is totally understandable, but we're going to go through it here. This is Andrew Yang. Any second.
I have a 6 and 3-year-old boy. I was imagining it was one of them that got shot and the other saw it. That scene that you described, I'm sorry, it's like very, very affecting. You're right that when there's a gun in the household, you're more likely to have a child get shot or the owner get shot than to kill, let's say, an intruder into the house. Those are just numbers. Those are just the facts.
All right, so there's Andrew Yang, and I'll say this just on the onset. I think that reaction was probably real. Because, I mean, hearing a story like that, of a kid dying, whether it's a gun or anything, I mean, whether it's cancer or whatever else, that is something that affects you emotionally. And so there were some people that were going after Yang and saying, well, he was just fake crying on stage. I don't believe that. I don't. I think that was probably a genuine reaction. I don't think that he was playing it up. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm naive. I don't know. But I'm totally giving him the benefit of the doubt on that, because that is a sad story. But just because the story is sad, and just because I think he was genuinely moved, that his emotions were genuinely stirred and spurred on by that, that doesn't mean that what he's saying is actually correct. In fact, I have quite a few numbers and statistics here. Let's go ahead and look at this first one, which the source here is the CDC and the Journal of Criminal Law. So this is every year in the U.S. 31,000 homicides, suicides, or accidental shootings happen in the U.S., which result in 15,000 fatalities. So 31,000 of those, and then 15,000 of those are deaths. Between 800,000 and 2.5 million defensive uses of firearms in a single year. So you compare those two, 31,000 homicides, suicides or accidental shootings, and then 15,000 deaths. So even if you're using the total number, you're not even just counting deaths, you're counting injuries from accidental discharges or intentional discharges of firearms. And you compare that to the number of times that they are being used defensively, even if you lowball it as much as humanly possible and use the lowest figure that the CDC gave, which is 800,000, it's still 25 times higher. Guns are used at the bare minimum 25 times higher for defensive purposes than they are to hurt another person, even accidentally. And if you use the highest figure that they gave, the highest possible figure, which is 2.5 million, it's 80 times higher. And so when Andrew Yang says, well, those are just the numbers, those are just the facts, sorry, no, they're not. And for a guy that is supposedly a math guy, somebody that's supposedly really intelligent, by the way, I think Yang is intelligent. In fact, I'll be honest, I never expected to have to do a daily dose of stupid for him. But he is just dead wrong on this. Being smart doesn't mean that you get to make up your own facts. All right, let's look at this. Annually in the USA, between 80,000 and 200,000 defensive uses of firearms, are women defending themselves from sexual assault. So this is only counting women specifically that are defending themselves from sexual assault, 80,000 to 200,000. Again, the numbers aren't even close. Andrew Yang is not just wrong, he's completely wrong. Not even close to the right answer. All right, let's check this out. Look at some other numbers. All right, give it a second. It's loading. I don't know why it's taking a while. There we go. Again, annually in the U.S., law enforcement, and that's from all different branches, from your local police officer and sheriff's office all the way up to the FBI. Law enforcement kills 606 criminals every single year. Private citizens with a firearm kill 1,527 criminals a year. So a little less than 4 times what police officers do. Now, you can chalk part of that up to police officers having other options. They also have tasers. They also have dogs. But that's not the only thing going on here. That wouldn't account for a difference that big. And so, yes, firearms are used correctly for defensive purposes all the time. Whether it's by women defending themselves from sexual assault, defending their kids, the simple fact is, if you look at the numbers, it overwhelmingly points to defensive use of firearms being a very common thing. Let's look at this one. The United Kingdom versus the USA. The USA has a violent crime rate of 466 per 100,000 citizens. Now, the rate in the UK, they have a violent crime rate of 2,034 per 100,000 citizens. So 4 times larger than the USA. In this same source, the European Commission report specifically said in there that the UK, in its opinion, has some of the strictest gun control laws in the Western Hemisphere. So, I mean, you're excluding Russia, but pretty much every other nation over there in the Eurasia, those 2 continents, UK has the strictest by far. And you have to think about that too. They live on a freaking island. If there was anywhere where gun control ought to work, it would be UK. They have a relatively small population, and they have an island. So it would be really hard to smuggle guns in from the outside. And yet, this isn't just gun crime. This is looking at violent crime overall. They're saying, well, guns are making crimes easier to commit. Guns are causing all these crimes. No. The violent crime rate in the UK is 4 times larger than the US. And the UK is essentially a giant gun-free zone, and yet they have way more crime. It's almost like knowing that you might get shot deters criminals. All right, let's look at this next one. We've been talking about violent crime, but this one specifically addresses mass shootings. Annually in the US, the average death rate when police officers stop a mass shooting is 14.3. So on average, and this is counting when hardly anyone dies and when a lot of people die. When you're talking about mass shootings where a police officer is the one that stopped it, 14.3. The average death when an armed citizen stops a mass shooting, 2.3. That is 6 times lower than when a police officer does it. Now, goodness knows, if you've watched this program for any amount of time, you know I love our police officers. And I even contemplated at one point doing what they do, and I said it's too tough for me. I wouldn't be able to handle it. I have an amazing amount of respect for our police officers. But they can't be everywhere at once. And they can't just magically appear places. And in mass shooting situations, where there is an armed person there, because the response time is so much faster, we have less deaths. And that is something to be applauded. Because as much as I revere our police officers, they're not omnipresent. They're not superheroes. I mean, it's not like Superman where he hears something across town and he zips over there because he's faster than the speed of light. And so we are safer with guns than without them. And Andrew Yang can say, well, that's just facts, that's just numbers. Well, no, the numbers actually don't agree with you at all. When you look at the numbers, you are at far more risk without a gun than you are with a gun. Whether you're trying to defend yourself from burglars or sexual assault or mass shootings, in every single case, if you're looking at the numbers, a person with a gun is safer. And there are horrible incidents like the one that was being talked about here. And sometimes those incidents happen from a lack of understanding about gun safety, which, by the way, if that was the problem, you know who you need to turn to for that? The NRA. They teach gun safety programs, and they're very good. I know some of the instructors. When Democrats are doing this, they're doing so blindly. And Andrew Yang, who is specifically someone who I thought I would never have to say this about, who I would never have to do a daily dose of stupid on, he just pulled an AOC, where he just kind of pulled something out of his butt and hoped that it panned out. Just kind of threw something out there and, well, I hope the numbers back me up because I'm going to say that they do. Sorry, they don't. There are a lot of issues out there where even though I have a very strong stance one way or the other, I can kind of see both sides. I can kind of see where they're coming from. There's some facts that kind of line up with their side of it. Not with guns. Not with guns at all. Every single statistic, every single one, points to guns making us safer. And when you're talking about government restrictions on them, you can't say that the statistics always point to us being safer without gun restrictions, but you can look at the statistics where they have gun restrictions and do a comparison and show that they're at the very least no safer. So at the absolute best case scenario, you wind up with exactly the same amount of gun violence, exactly the same amount of crime, but less liberty. That's the absolute best you can hope for if you're looking at the stats. And I'm not willing to accept that. You shouldn't ever sacrifice liberty for security, but you certainly shouldn't when you can actually look at the numbers and it shows that you're going to get less security, or at the very least equal security, and you are guaranteed less liberty because that's what you're sacrificing. It makes no sense to go along with these policies. And Andrew Yang, I'm sorry, I know you're a really smart guy, and even though I don't agree with most of your policies, I do think that you usually come at them from an angle of academic honesty, and you want to have that discussion and want to hear good ideas. This one you just pulled crap out of your butt and got caught. Sorry, buddy. All right, let's look at the next clip. This one is Kristen Gillibrand.
As president, I will pass universal background checks. I will pass a federal anti-gun trafficking law, and I will ban the assault rifle.
Okay, so Kristen Gillibrand talking about what she's going to do. So we're just going to sort of rapid fire, pun intended, through this one. First of all, we already have universal background checks. It's already a thing. When Democrats usually say that they're going to have universal background checks, they're not talking about the background check you go to buy a gun, because that's already a thing. Anybody that's actually bought a gun from a federally licensed firearm dealer understands that that's the way that it works. Anybody that has an FFL, you got to go through a background check. There are no stores. You're not allowed to operate a business that sells guns that doesn't have one of those. And if you have one, you have to run a background check on everybody. That's a federal law. And the only thing that they're talking about is making it to where everybody, if you're going to transfer your gun, has to have a background check, which causes a problem in the sense that, first of all, to do that, or to enforce it at least, you would by default have to have a gun database of some kind. In other words, have a list of everybody that has a gun, which causes a whole slew of other problems that we've talked about in videos in the past. But without getting off into that, you understand that if that takes place, enforcement is going to be virtually impossible unless you have some kind of database with all the guns in it, which would defeat the purpose of the Second Amendment in the first place. But on the other side of that, what you're going to run into is, do you really think that people are going to be okay with the government mandating that they sell a gun to a neighbor or to a family member, or even not even sell it, just pass it down? That because my pawpaw dies and I inherit one of his guns, which, I hope is a long ways off, but it'll probably happen at some point, that I all of a sudden am in violation of the law just because I inherited a gun from somebody? Because that's the way it is in some of these liberal states. These are the kinds of laws that they've enacted. that just by being in possession of a gun, just by having it, that you are now a criminal just because you didn't go through some kind of process. You didn't go to the law and say, oh, by the way, my dad died and I inherited his gun. You see the slew of unintended consequences that opens up before you when that happens. That's what they're talking about when they say universal background checks. And once you explain that to the average person, they say, oh, well, that's asinine. You don't need to do that. They always tout this number, and they talked about it a lot at this conference. I don't have any clips of it, but just they mentioned it a lot. This 94% of people agreeing with universal background checks. Yeah, but when you actually explain what it is, that number drops significantly to about half and half. And so this whole universal background checks and it being agreed on, it's completely misleading because what they hear is, oh, universal background checks aren't already a thing. Yes, they are. The only thing that doesn't cover is if you're just you're buddies with somebody and you sell it to them. That's the only thing that it doesn't cover, and that's the loophole that they're trying to close up. Also, gun trafficking and straw purchasing, already illegal. She says that she's going to enact some kind of federal gun trafficking law. Well, there's not one on the books because the states already have that covered, which makes sense. Law enforcement is primarily a state thing. There are some federal laws they have to enforce, but primarily the states are the ones in charge of busting people for that. So they're kind of already covered on that front. Gun trafficking is already against the law. Straw purchasing, already against the law. There's no reason to have a federal law against that. She's just saying things that sound good to her voter base. And then the whole, I'm going to ban the assault rifle. I'm not going to touch this one, not because I don't think it's important, but because the next Democrats that we have talking about this, I'm going to cover it with their statement. This is Pete Buttigieg and Tim Ryan.
AKs, ARs, they have no business in our neighborhoods in peacetime in the United States of America. They are for war zones.
We need to continue to mobilize the people of the United States to get behind this issue that has the support of Democrats and Republicans and hunters and veterans that say that these weapons of war should not be on the streets of the United States of America.
Well, daggone. If the veterans say it's okay, then I guess I ought to think it's okay too. Veterans, go home, Tim Ryan. You're drunk. Anyway, again, and this goes back to what I was just saying with Kristen Gillibrand. He's talking about how it's universally agreed upon. It is until you explain to people exactly what it is. Once you tell people, hey, what they're talking about means X, they go, oh, well, that's dumb. I don't want to do that. Most of the time. There are some, obviously, that do. There are some people that are diehard liberals that believe you ought to just take away guns altogether. But the vast majority of the average American, once you actually explain what that policy would do, they all of a sudden are not really keen on it. A lot of them. So that's kind of a misnomer in and of itself. But the best part about that, where they were talking about getting rid of these weapons of war, getting rid of the AK and the AR-15, Pete Buttigieg apparently does not know nearly as much about guns as he claims to. Now, the guy's a vet, so I'm assuming he knows at least something about guns. But if he does, he's either intentionally lying here, or he doesn't know nearly as much about guns as he claims, because the AK-47 is an illegal rifle. It's already illegal because it has a fully auto setting. So it can be semi-auto, but you can also flip up a little switch on the side of it and it becomes full auto, which is illegal. It's super illegal, actually. To actually be somebody that can own a fully automatic weapon in this country, you basically have to be a millionaire. And they have to know everything about you to even possess one. Not just to buy one new, just to hold one, to have one. So he's either, again, completely ignorant of the gun laws in this country, or he's intentionally lying to you. I'm not sure which. And then when it comes to the AR-15, he's saying that they have no business in this country in peacetime. Yeah, the AR-15 was originally a hunting rifle. It was. It was adopted by the military, or at least the overall design was later, and then adapted into something that would be more suited for the battlefield, but the AR-15 originally, the Armalite rifle, was originally put together as a hunting platform rifle. That was the original design. And while some of the cosmetics of the different designs of AR-15s have changed over the years, barrel shrouds, that kind of thing, the functionality hasn't. Still uses the same caliber, still uses the same action. Same rate of fire, everything. It was originally designed as a hunting rifle, and it can still be used as such. So, Pete Buttigieg, again, either intentionally misleading people or he's completely ignorant on this. And then, I love this moniker, the weapons of war. The weapons of war thing is so dumb. Every weapon can be a weapon of war. You know what weapon was used in way more wars than any firearm? The bow and arrow. Historically, it's been used way more than any firearm. The same is also true of swords. Same is true of also of knives. Heck, if there's a guy that happens to have a baseball bat on a battlefield, technically that becomes a weapon of war. And I'm sure that there were cavemen clubbing each other with rocks at some point. That would have made it a weapon of war. The weapons of war thing is just something to scare people. That's all it is. There are no soldiers, at least American soldiers, maybe they're, I don't know, some Al-Qaeda terrorists or something out there that do have an AR-15, but there are no American soldiers that carry an AR-15. There aren't. You know what has been used as a weapon of war a lot more? A Remington 870, a shotgun, and yet nobody's talking about banning those. The Remington 870, which by the way I own one, great shotgun, America's shotgun, fantastic. Nobody's talking about getting rid of those, even though those have been used in far more wars than the AR-15, because the AR-15 has been used in 0 wars. The 870, I believe it first made its debut, right before North Korea? Something like that. I'd have to look at my military history. But the point is, you can call things weapons of war. That's just a term to scare you. That's all it is. And because the idiots that they're talking to at the Everytown Summit, they don't know the difference. All they hear is some scary sounding letters, and it sounds like a military thing, and a guy who used to be in the military is saying it, so they assume that he knows what he's talking about. They shouldn't, but they do. And so the weapons of war thing is just completely meaningless. But here's the thing that's underlying that makes it even more problematic. If it's not a weapon of war, it does not serve the purpose that the Second Amendment was originally intended to fulfill. You can go back and look at a segment I did where I talked about some of the founders, specifically George Mason and James Madison, for a little bit more fleshing out on this that I did last week with Chris Cuomo on guns. But the whole purpose, and the founders all understood this and talked about it very often, the whole purpose of the Second Amendment was not for hunting. It was not for sport shooting, shooting skeets and things like that. The purpose of the Second Amendment was to protect us from a government, whether it was our own government or gone rogue or somebody else trying to invade us. That was the reason we have a Second Amendment. So if it's not a weapon of war, if it's not something that could be used against a military, it no longer serves its purpose. In fact, you know what's hilarious? The sawed-off shotgun, do you know what the rationale was for being able to make that illegal by the Supreme Court? They said it has no military application. Their rationale was that the only reason the Second Amendment exists is that it's supposed to be a backstop against a rogue government. And because that's the purpose, if it doesn't do that, in other words, if you can't use it for that purpose, then the government can make it illegal. You see how much we flipped on this? Their standard when the sawed-off shotgun was made illegal was that the only reason that we can do that is because it has no military application. The whole point is that the guns that are available to the public that we can arm ourselves are able to be used against a military. And so they've completely flipped it on its head. Pete Buttigieg is saying, well, because it's a weapon of war, then we shouldn't have it on the streets. Well, yeah, actually, that's exactly the reason we need it on the streets, is that it's a weapon of war. In fact, we need weapons that are on par with the military if you're going for the original meaning of the Second Amendment. So, just to sum up on all this, some of it's stupid, some of it's flat out lying, but the lying only works because the people listening are stupid. Now you're not one of them because you know the difference. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today does come from the book of 2 John. And I think the reason that this one really came to mind is because of what we were just talking about. The truth does matter. And when we intentionally deceive other people for our own gain, that's something that God does not look fondly upon. And the reason is because it's such a contrast to the kind of person that he wants in his kingdom. And a great proof of that comes from the book of 2 John, chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. The elder to the chosen lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, for the sake of the truth which abides in us and will be with us forever, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us, from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and love. Now, this is John kind of getting ready for his sign-off here. And he's sort of giving some parting thoughts. So he's talking specifically to a specific few Christians. And you notice what he says in there. He talks about the truth abiding in us. What does it mean for the truth to abide in us? What would that look like to an outside observer, and how can we know if we ourselves are the kind of people that have the truth abiding in us? Well, we know that Christ dwells in us. That's found in Ephesians 3:17. So we understand that Christ is something that dwells in those that are following him. And Christ is God, of course, and God is truth. So in that sense, we could just say that, what John's talking about here is that because Christ dwells inside of us, as Paul tells us in Ephesians, that the truth, because A equals A, is also abiding in us. Well, I don't think that's an incorrect way to look at it, but I think that we can flesh that idea out a little bit more. I don't think that John is merely saying that Christ dwells in us, because if that's what he wanted to say, he would have come out and say it. I mean, come on. The Apostle John's a very plain-spoken person anyway. He's very direct. And I think in this particular passage where he is speaking to us, and inspiration is taking a part of this, that line is not accidental. That when he says truth abides in us, he wanted to instill in them the idea that being truthful is dwelling inside of us. And when something dwells inside of you, you can tell. It sort of protrudes outward. Just like we're supposed to emulate Christ, just like we're supposed to put on Christ, and other people are supposed to look at us and see a little bit of Christ living in us. People are also supposed to look at us and see that we are a person in whom the truth dwells, which means we're to be trustworthy, we're to be honest both in word and deed. And so we need to make it intentional that we are truthful with others. And I think that includes, of course, a couple of things. First of all, obvious, but don't lie to other people. I think it extends further than that, though. Don't lie to God and don't lie to yourself. I can't tell you the number of times I have fallen into temptation and sin because I lied to myself. I told myself, okay, this wasn't that bad, or okay, I can handle this, or all right, I'll just kind of get close to sin, but not actually, technically sin, and so I'll just get real close to it, but not actually go over that threshold. I knew it was wrong. I knew I shouldn't have done it. I lied to myself to allow myself to do that. And isn't that true of an awful lot of people in the scripture? David lied to himself, telling himself, oh, I can handle looking at this naked woman on the rooftop. Nothing bad's going to happen. I mean, it happened to Judas. He lied to himself about whether or not he could be loyal to Christ. It happened to Jonah. Jonah is saying, oh, I can escape God. He won't know where I'm going. Yeah, how'd that work out for you? So the Bible is filled with stories of people who lied to themselves and got themselves in trouble. And so it's almost like a gateway sin, like a gateway drug. People that the truth was not dwelling inside of them, and it did not guide their actions and guide their decisions. They were able to deceive themselves into getting themselves into trouble. And it's unfortunate, but that's the situation that we often find ourselves in too. And so I think the first step of the truth abiding in us is that we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be honest about our own limitations. We have to be honest about the things that we can and can't do. We have to be honest about the things that we're good at, because that's going to help us learn how we're going to do good for the kingdom. And so this whole idea of living the Christian life, I think in a lot of ways starts with this idea of the truth abiding in us. And what does he say afterward? He says that if you have truth abiding in you, then you have grace, mercy, and peace. But these things only happen if we start with truth. First of all, grace. Well, you can't extend grace to somebody that is dishonest or unrepentant. I mean, you can give them more and more chances, but if they're continuing to lie to themselves, if they are continuing to live out that sinful lifestyle and they have not repented and don't realize that what they're doing is wrong, in other words, they're lying to themselves saying that I'm okay, well, then God's not going to extend grace to those people because they have not come before his throne and asked for forgiveness. So that's the first one. You can't have that without the truth abiding in you. And then there's mercy. To have, you have to own your sins before you realize that you even need mercy. You're not going to ask for mercy if you think that you're okay. If you think what you're doing is not sinful, if you have lied to yourself about whether or not what you're doing is right, then you're not going to come before God and say, please forgive me, because you don't think there's anything to be forgiven. You're not going to be the recipient of God's mercy. You'll notice that in the parables of the Gospels, whenever somebody does come to the master in whatever parable that Christ is telling, they have to want mercy. They have to realize that they are in need of mercy before it is granted to them. And so someone that's still in that fog, that haze of sin, and doesn't really understand where they are, they don't have the truth abiding in them, they can't have mercy either. And then finally, there's peace. Now, this one ought to be pretty obvious, especially for anybody that's ever gotten caught up in a lie. There is nothing more stressful, nothing that creates unrest more in a person than living out a lie. Whether it's trying to juggle a web of lies that you've told other people and trying not to get caught, or it's just living in a way that is not in concert with God's will for you, living in open rebellion against God, believing that the way that you're living is okay. That's not a peaceful lifestyle. You're going to be fraught with unrest. If you want that peace that passes all understanding, if you want the kind of peace that God can grant both on this side of eternity and the next, it has to start with truth. You have to acknowledge He is God, I am me, He knows better than I do, and I need to submit my will. You'll notice that when you look at the people that were saved, the people that came to Christ, what did they do first? It all started with believing in the truth. Because that's how faith starts. It can't go anywhere without that. And so all the amazing things that God offers us, all the amazing things that we have through the death of Jesus Christ, all of it has to start with truth. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.